The throne room of Queen Zaravis shimmered with the light of bioluminescent plants coiling along the tall, crystalline walls. Everything about the space radiated power, from the gilded arches to the subtle fragrance of rare flowers found only on the Queen's private worlds. Zaravis, seated upon her elevated throne, surveyed her gathered advisors with a cool, calculating gaze. She wasn't a ruler given to sentiment or mistakes, and when her rival, Lord Kretach, began making power moves to claim her throne, she knew she needed to act fast and ruthlessly. No loyal soldier or advisor could be trusted with what she had in mind. She needed someone reckless, someone dangerous, someone expendable, and there was only one species that fit that description perfectly: humans, Deathworlders. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and John Voss strolled into the throne room. Zaravis sat upright, her antennae twitching with distaste and curiosity. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with a nonchalance that bordered on arrogance. His combat suit, scratched and patched from 100 battles, clung to him like second skin. A lazy smirk played at the corner of his mouth, as if the idea of standing before an alien queen didn't faze him in the slightest. "You're the human mercenary?" Zaravis asked, her voice a silk-covered dagger. "John Voss, at your service, Your Majesty," he replied, giving an exaggerated bow that towed the line between mocking and respectful. Her advisors shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. Humans were a relatively new addition to the galactic community, and their reputation preceded them, known for their unpredictability, resilience, and a certain disregard for self-preservation. Deathworlders like Voss were equal parts terrifying and fascinating. Zaravis studied him carefully. "I have a task for you, a dangerous one. You are to infiltrate the palace of Lord Kretach and eliminate him, efficiently and discreetly. Do you understand?" Voss tilted his head slightly, his hazel eyes gleaming with amusement. "Dangerous mission, lots of risks, little reward. I'm guessing you don't expect me to survive this." Her lips curled into a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Number I don't." The human chuckled softly, as if he found her bluntness charming. "I like your style. You'll find schematics and key points of entry in the mission packet," she continued, ignoring his remark. "You'll be paid handsomely if you succeed. If you fail, well, you won't be around to care." Voss took the datapad handed to him by one of her aides and glanced over it, his smirk widening. "Seems simple enough. In, out, no fuss." He looked up, locking eyes with her. "You sure you want me to follow this plan to the letter, though?" Zaravis frowned. "Why wouldn't I?" "Just asking," he replied with a shrug. "Plans are nice, but things don't always go according to plan, especially when you're dealing with people like me." She arched an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. "And what exactly are people like you?" He grinned, a flash of white teeth. "We improvise." With that, Voss turned and walked toward the exit, his boots echoing against the marble floor. Zaravis watched him go, something strange stirring in her chest, something close to unease. She'd dealt with countless mercenaries, assassins, and spies over her reign. All of them had been predictable in their motivations and behavior. But this human, there was something different about him. Something dangerous, not just to her enemies, but perhaps to her as well. For a moment she considered canceling the contract. But no, she was Queen Zaravis, ruler of the Valexian Empire. No human, no matter how unpredictable, could pose a threat to her. He was just a tool, after all, a disposable pawn in a much larger game. As the doors hissed shut behind Voss, one of her advisors leaned in cautiously. "Your Majesty, do you truly believe the human can be trusted with such a delicate task?" Zaravis's antennae twitched in irritation. But he doesn't need to be trustworthy. He just needs to be useful." Out in the corridor, John Voss strolled through the palace halls, whistling softly to himself. He glanced at the datapad again, committing the details of the mission to memory. It was a straightforward assassination. Get in, neutralize the target, and get out. Easy money. But as he walked, a mischievous gleam lit his eyes. Following orders had never really been his thing, and something about the Queen, well, she was too careful, too calculating. A person like that needed someone to shake things up. He tapped the communicator clipped to his ear. "Hey, Your Majesty," he said cheerfully. "Mind if I go off script a bit during this mission?" Zaravis's voice crackled through the earpiece, sharp and cold. "Stick to the plan, human." Sure, he replied easily. "Just checking. You never know, sometimes things go smoother when you throw the rulebook out the airlock." There was a brief, irritated silence on the other end. Then, "I hired you to complete the mission, not to indulge your whims." Voss grinned. "Got it. Mission first, whims second, loud and clear." He could almost hear her frustration through the communicator, and the thought made him chuckle. She was fun to mess with, far too serious for her own good. He wondered how long it had been since someone had talked to her without fear or formality. As he boarded the sleek transport that would take him to Lord Kretak's palace, he leaned back in the pilot's seat, hands resting lazily behind his head. He didn't know exactly how this mission would play out, but one thing was certain: it wouldn't be boring. Meanwhile, back in her throne room, Zaravis stared at the empty space where Voss had stood moments ago. She tapped her claws lightly against the armrest of her throne, deep in thought. There was something unsettling about that human, something she couldn't quite place. He was supposed to be a tool, a means to an end, a pawn, but for the first time in years she felt as though she might not be entirely in control of the game. The thought should have disturbed her. Instead, it intrigued her. "Your Majesty," one of her aides asked cautiously, "shall we prepare for the aftermath of the mission?" Zaravis smiled, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in her gaze. "Yes, but keep a close watch on our new mercenary." "As you command," the aide replied with a bow. Zaravis leaned back in her throne, her mind swirling with possibilities. The human was unpredictable, yes, but perhaps that was exactly what she needed. For better or worse, the game had begun, and she wasn't sure who would emerge victorious. Out in the cold void of space, John Voss grinned to himself as the stars blurred past the transport's cockpit. He could feel it in his bones. This was going to be one hell of a job, and if the Queen thought she could control him, well, she was in for a surprise. The sleek black transport slid silently through the darkened skies above Lord Kretak's estate, its hull absorbing any signals that might give it away. John Voss grinned as he steered the ship with one hand, the other drumming idly on the control panel. Beneath the canopy, the sprawling palace glittered with alien lights, a fortress of wealth and secrets. His communicator crackled to life in his ear. "You should have landed by now, human," came Zaravis's cold voice. "Yeah, about that," Voss replied cheerfully. "I figured landing might be a little too predictable. I've got something better in mind." There was a beat of silence. "Stick to the plan, Voss." "Relax, Your Majesty, I've got this," he said, flipping a switch on the control panel. The transport slowed, hovering just above the palace's outer walls. With a grin, Voss opened the cargo bay doors and leaped into the night air. The wind roared in his ears as he free-fell toward the estate below, but his grin only widened. Mid-fall, he deployed a slim cable, his descent halting with a sudden jolt as he swung toward the palace's exterior like a human comet. The grappling hook latched onto a ledge, and with a flick of his wrist, Voss flipped onto the balcony. He crouched low, taking in his surroundings. No alarms, no guards in sight. "Perfect. Still alive, Your Majesty," he whispered into the communicator. "I should have hired someone less enthusiastic," Zaravis muttered, though there was a hint of amusement in her tone. Voss chuckled softly as he navigated the balcony, slipping past ornate statues and shimmering curtains that rippled in the breeze. He'd done this kind of work before, breaking and entering, a little sabotage, maybe a sprinkle of chaos, but never on a job quite like this. Most clients preferred silence, precision, but with Zaravis watching his every move, Voss couldn't resist the urge to add some flair. He moved like a shadow through the palace, bypassing security systems with practiced ease. Where other mercenaries might have relied on brute force or complex tech, Voss used intuition and sheer audacity. A hallway guarded by cameras, he simply strolled past them, acting as though he belonged there. A locked door with a biometric scanner. He picked up a passing servant's tray, mimicked their stride, and walked through the door without anyone batting an eye. "You're inside already?" Zaravis's voice sounded incredulous in his ear. "Piece of cake," Voss whispered. "Your rival needs to hire better security, or at least guards who aren't allergic to confidence." He could almost hear Zaravis's irritation, and it made him grin. "I swear, human, if you ruin this mission—" "Relax, Your Majesty, I've got it under control," he said, suppressing a chuckle. "Well, mostly under control." The next part of the plan was to reach the main chamber, where Lord Kretak held court. But instead of slipping quietly past the remaining defenses, Voss decided to make things a bit more interesting. He approached a pair of heavily armed guards standing by the entrance to the chamber. With a casual whistle, Voss strolled up to them, hands in his pockets. The guards immediately tensed, their weapons raised. "Evening, gentlemen," Voss said with a friendly nod. "Lovely place you've got here. Mind if I pop inside for a quick chat with the boss?" The guards exchanged bewildered glances, unsure whether to shoot him or call for backup. Before they could decide, Voss reached into his pocket and produced a small, sleek device. He clicked it once, and the lights in the entire hallway flickered ominously. "Oops," Voss said with mock concern. "Looks like your security system's having a bad day. You might want to get that checked." The guards hesitated for a moment too long. Voss moved like lightning, disarming them both with a flick of his wrist. They crumpled to the floor, unconscious but unharmed. "Show off," Zaravis muttered in his ear. Voss grinned as he slipped into the main chamber, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished floor. Lord Kretach sat at the far end of the room, surrounded by lavish decor and flickering holographic displays. "Kretach, buddy," Voss called cheerfully. "We need to talk." The alien lord's eyes widened in shock as Voss sauntered toward him. What are you doing here?" "Funny thing," Voss said, leaning casually against a pillar. "Your old friend Queen Zaravis sent me. Said you were causing her some trouble." Kretach sneered, recovering quickly. "And you thought you could waltz in here and end me? You humans are fools." Voss shrugged. "Yeah, I get that a lot." He tapped the side of his head, activating his communicator. "Hey, Your Majesty, you still listening? We've got a bit of a situation. You were supposed to eliminate him," Zaravis hissed. "Yeah, about that," Voss said with a grin. "I figured we could use him instead." Kretach blinked in confusion. "Use me? For what? You're not the real problem, pal," Voss said. "You're just a pawn in someone else's game. But lucky for you, I'm real good at flipping the board." Zaravis's voice cut in sharply. "What do you think you're doing, Voss?" "Improvising," he replied with a grin. Kretach watched in stunned silence as Voss began laying out a new plan, one that involved turning the alien lord into an unexpected ally. It was risky, unpredictable, and exactly the kind of thing Zaravis would never have done. "You're mad," Kretach muttered, though there was a flicker of admiration in his gaze. "Probably," Voss agreed, "but it's a fun way to live." In her palace, Zaravis listened to the unfolding events with a mixture of frustration and fascination. The human was reckless, infuriatingly confident, and completely uncontrollable. And yet, everything he did seemed to work. Against all odds, Voss had not only infiltrated her rival's palace but was now flipping the entire situation on its head. And somehow, impossibly, it was working. As Voss and Kretach continued their conversation, Zaravis found herself smiling, a small, reluctant smile that surprised even her. "Perhaps I underestimated you, human," she whispered. On the other end of the communicator, Voss grinned as if he'd heard her. "Just wait, Your Majesty," he said softly. "The real fun's only just starting." The flickering light of holograms cast shifting patterns on the walls of Kretach's opulent chamber. John Voss leaned lazily against a pillar, watching the alien lord with a smug grin as he revealed his hand. Kretach, still recovering from the audacity of the human's arrival, looked between Voss and the glowing datapad in disbelief. On its display was information he never thought anyone, let alone a Deathworlder, would uncover. "You've been keeping secrets, Kretach," Voss said, casually swiping through incriminating messages and accounts tied to a conspiracy that stretched deep into the political heart of Zaravis's empire. Kretach's green skin paled to an unsettling shade. "Where did you get that information?" he hissed. "Let's just say your security wasn't quite up to snuff," Voss replied, flashing that infuriating grin again. "But here's the kicker. It doesn't just implicate you, it ties back to our dear queen as well." Zaravis's voice crackled through Voss's earpiece, colder than the vacuum of space. "What are you doing, Voss? This isn't part of the mission." Voss ignored her for the moment, locking eyes with Kretach. "I could kill you right now and be done with it. That's what your old friend Zaravis paid me to do after all. But it seems like there's a bigger game being played, and I hate not knowing all the rules." Kretach sneered, though fear flickered behind his gaze. "You think you can outmaneuver the queen, foolish human." "Maybe," Voss shrugged. "Or maybe I just enjoy stirring the pot." Zaravis's voice snapped over the comms. "You are testing my patience, human. Eliminate him now." Voss gave a soft chuckle. "Patience, Your Majesty. I think we both want the same thing, but you're too stubborn to see it." He shifted his stance, keeping his eyes on Kretach. "I have a proposition. You and I, we can flip this whole thing on its head. We make sure the right people take the fall. Maybe save your skin in the process." Kretach narrowed his eyes, weighing his options. He knew better than to trust the human, but the alternative, facing Zaravis's wrath alone, wasn't appealing either. "And what do you want in return, mercenary?" Voss grinned. "Just your cooperation. For now." Zaravis hissed in frustration through the comm. "You are playing with fire, Voss. You have no idea what forces you're meddling with." "Probably not," Voss admitted, "but I've always liked a little heat." Kretach paced the room, his long cloak trailing behind him. The gears in his mind turned visibly as he calculated his odds. Finally, he stopped and faced the human. "If I agree to your terms, what guarantee do I have that you won't betray me?" Voss winked. "None. But hey, Life's more fun with a little risk, right? Zaravis's voice, sharp and edged with something unfamiliar. Was it anxiety? Cut through the earpiece. Voss, if you do not follow the plan, you will regret it. Probably, Voss said, tapping his earpiece as if swatting away a persistent fly. But where's the fun in doing things the boring way? Kretach stared at the human, then gave a reluctant nod. Fine, we play this your way, for now. Voss clapped his hands together, the grin never leaving his face. Now you're getting it. This is going to be great. With the new arrangement in place, Voss activated a secure channel and transmitted encrypted data directly to Zaravis's private terminal. There, Your Majesty. Consider this a gift. You've got all the proof you need to tie up some loose ends, and maybe rethink that whole kill Kretach plan while you're at it. On the other end, Zaravis stared at the data that flashed across her screen. It was worse than she feared. The conspiracy reached higher than expected, touching figures she couldn't afford to confront head-on. For the first time in a long while, the Queen felt something dangerously close to uncertainty. You're impossible, Voss, she muttered, though her voice lacked its usual bite. Glad you're finally catching on, Voss replied, grinning. Now, I assume you're not going to call off the mission just yet, are you? Zaravis was silent for a moment, weighing her options. She hated being outmaneuvered, but she hated unpredictability even more, and Voss was proving to be dangerously unpredictable. Proceed with caution, she said at last. But remember this, human, there are limits to my patience. Voss's grin widened. That's what makes this fun. With a nod to Kretach, Voss motioned toward the chamber's exit. Come on, pal. Time to crash this party properly. Together they slipped through the palace halls, their unlikely partnership drawing curious glances from servants and guards alike. Voss moved with the easy confidence of someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere all at once, while Kretach followed, still adjusting to the strange new dynamic between them. As they approached the grand hall where the real power brokers gathered, Voss leaned in close to Kretach. Okay, here's the plan. I improvise, and you try not to get us killed. Kretach gave him a withering glare. That's not a plan. It is if you believe hard enough, Voss replied with a grin. They entered the hall together, the grand space alive with murmurs and whispers. Zaravis's political enemies were gathered here, along with the factions that had backed Kretach's attempted coup. The room fell into a tense silence as the two entered, all eyes turning toward them. Good evening, everyone, Voss called cheerfully. Lovely place you've got here, bit stuffy though. The tension in the room thickened, and hands drifted toward concealed weapons. Kretach shot Voss a glare, but the human seemed entirely unbothered. And now for the main event, Voss continued, his grin never faltering. Let's talk about treason, conspiracies, and all the fun ways you've been trying to stab each other in the back. Gasps and murmurs erupted as Voss casually dropped encrypted data onto the central display for everyone to see. It was a carefully curated selection, just enough to expose key players without endangering Zaravis directly. A scandal of galactic proportions. You're mad, Kretach whispered, though his eyes gleamed with admiration. Yeah, Voss whispered back, but it's working. In her palace, Zaravis watched the scene unfold through her private terminal, her emotions a tangled web of frustration, intrigue, and something dangerously close to admiration. Voss had done the unthinkable. He'd taken her carefully laid plans, shattered them, and somehow made things better. For now, the room erupted into chaos as factions scrambled to realign themselves, abandoning old alliances and forming new ones in real time. In the center of it all, Voss stood like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of disorder. Mission accomplished, Your Majesty, Voss whispered into his earpiece. More or less. On the other end, Zaravis couldn't help but smile. Just a little. You're insufferable, human. You love it, Voss replied with a wink. And to her surprise, Zaravis found that maybe, just maybe, she did. The grand hall buzzed with tension, factions shifting in real time as alliances formed and broke under the weight of Voss's revelations. The scandal he had ignited was spreading through the assembly like wildfire. Zaravis's enemies and allies alike scrambled to distance themselves from exposed conspirators, while others moved in to capitalize on the sudden chaos. In the center of it all, Voss stood with Kretach at his side, a smug grin plastered across his face. In her private palace, Zaravis leaned forward in her throne, eyes narrowed as she watched the chaos unfold through her private feed. Voss had done the impossible, turning a mission that should have been straightforward assassination into a political firestorm. But somehow, infuriatingly, it was working. You're reckless, Voss, Zaravis said through the earpiece. This is going to spiral out of control. That's the fun part, Voss replied cheerfully, stepping back as rival factions bickered and postured around the hall. Chaos is just order waiting to happen. You just have to know where to push. Kratak shot him a skeptical glance. You're insane. Yeah, Voss admitted, flashing a grin, but I'm good at it. As the hall erupted into another round of shouting, Voss tilted his head, his earpiece buzzing with a sudden alert. A transmission from one of Zaravis's aides crackled through the channel. There's a complication, Your Majesty, the aide reported. We've intercepted communications. Someone's planning an assassination attempt tonight. They're targeting both Kratak and you. Zaravis's blood ran cold, her mind racing. She knew the risks of the game she played, but she hadn't expected things to escalate this quickly. And with Voss running wild in the middle of the storm, the situation was slipping further from her control. Voss, she hissed through the comm. There's a plot to take us both out. Get Kratak out of there now. Voss's grin faltered slightly as he processed the new information. Well, that's inconvenient. Kratak tensed, his hand drifting toward the concealed weapon at his side. You brought this on us, human. Voss rolled his eyes. Relax, I've got this. He turned toward the hall's exit, tapping his earpiece as he moved. Your Majesty, I hope you've got a good escape plan. Things are about to get lively. Zaravis clenched her fists, struggling to maintain her composure. Just get out of there in one piece, Voss. Don't worry, he said with a wink. I've survived worse. Voss led Kratak through the twisting corridors of the palace, keeping a sharp eye out for potential threats. His instincts screamed at him. This was the part of the mission where things usually went sideways, and right on cue, a group of shadowy figures emerged from the darkness ahead, weapons drawn. Assassins. Well, that didn't take long, Voss muttered, pulling Kratak behind a column as energy bolts sizzled through the air. Great plan, human, Kratak snarled, returning fire with his sidearm. Voss grinned, adrenaline surging through him. I told you, improvisation is the key. He tapped his earpiece. Your Majesty, any chance you've got backup on the way? Working on it, Zaravis replied, her voice tight with frustration. Hold them off. Reinforcements are en route. See? Voss said to Kratak as he fired a few shots at the advancing assassins. Teamwork. Kratak gave him a withering glare, but before he could respond, more assassins poured into the corridor, cutting off their escape route. All right, Plan B, Voss muttered, glancing around. Or is it Plan C? I lose track sometimes. He spotted a narrow maintenance shaft along the wall and motioned to Kratak. In there, now. Kratak hesitated, then nodded, slipping into the shaft with Voss close behind. The tight space forced them to crawl through the narrow confines, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. You do this kind of thing often? Kratak grumbled. You have no idea, Voss replied, grinning despite the danger. They emerged into a utility corridor, and Voss scanned the area, his mind racing. Okay, we're clear. For now. Kratak leaned against the wall, catching his breath. This is madness. Yeah, Voss agreed, but it's working. Before Kratak could respond, Voss's earpiece buzzed again. Your Majesty, we're out, but we've got a lot of unfriendly company. What's the plan? Zaravis's voice came through, calm but determined. Head to the rendezvous point, I'll meet you there. Voss raised an eyebrow. You're joining us? Didn't think this was your style. It isn't, Zaravis replied, but desperate times call for desperate measures. Voss chuckled. You're starting to sound like me, Your Majesty. Zaravis's voice softened, just for a moment. Let's hope that's a good thing. They made their way through the palace, evading patrols and skirmishing with assassins at every turn. Despite the chaos, Voss couldn't help but feel a strange sense of exhilaration. This was what he lived for, the thrill of the unexpected, the rush of danger. And, strangely enough, the banter with Zaravis was becoming one of his favorite parts of the job. When they finally reached the rendezvous point, a hidden alcove near the palace's eastern wall, Zaravis was already waiting, her elegant form shrouded in the shadows. You're late, she said, her tone dry. Traffic, Voss replied with a grin. Zaravis gave him a long, appraising look, then nodded. We're not out of this yet. Follow me. They slipped through the palace's outer defenses, Zaravis leading the way with a precision born of years of political maneuvering. Voss kept pace beside her, his senses on high alert. You know, he said quietly, you're pretty good at this for a queen. Zaravis glanced at him, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. You're not as unbearable as I expected, human. Voss grinned. I'll take that as a compliment. As they moved through the palace grounds, a sense of uneasy camaraderie settled between them. Despite the odds and their wildly different personalities, they made a surprisingly effective team, but the danger wasn't over yet. As they reached the final gate, more assassins emerged from the shadows, cutting off their escape. Of course, Voss muttered, drawing his weapon. It's never easy, is it? Zaravis stepped forward, her gaze cold and determined. Stay close, human. Together they fought their way through the attackers, their movements synchronized in a way that felt almost natural. Voss's reckless energy complemented Zaravis's calculated precision, creating a dance of chaos and order that left their enemies scrambling. When the last assassin fell, Voss leaned against the gate, catching his breath. Not bad, Your Majesty. Zaravis gave him a rare smile. You're not so bad yourself, human. Voss grinned, despite the lingering danger. So, what's next? Zaravis's smile faded slightly, her gaze thoughtful. Now we deal with the fallout, together. For the first time in a long while, Zaravis felt something strange. Hope. It was reckless and dangerous, but it was there, and she knew deep down that nothing would ever be the same again. The palace grounds lay silent under a sky littered with stars. Voss and Zaravis stood side by side at the edge of the escape route, the battle behind them but the weight of the moment pressing down like gravity. The assassins had failed, but the true storm was still gathering. They both knew that. The conspirators weren't just gunning for Kretak, they wanted Zaravis gone, and the throne claimed for someone they could control. Tonight had only been the beginning. Well, Your Majesty, Voss said, holstering his weapon with a satisfied grin. This little dance of ours isn't over just yet, is it? Zaravis adjusted her cloak, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon for any more threats. No, she replied quietly, but we made it through the first step. Now comes the hard part. You mean harder than running from assassins all night? Voss asked with a laugh. Zaravis gave him a sidelong glance, her lips twitching in what could have almost been a smile. Yes, harder. Their temporary alliance had pulled them through the chaos, but it was built on fragile trust and shared danger. Now that the immediate threat was behind them, the question loomed. Where did they stand with each other? Voss leaned casually against the stone gate, his easy smile softening just slightly. So, Your Majesty, what's the plan now? I assume it's more complicated than just surviving the night. It always is, Zaravis replied, her voice low and thoughtful. We need to confront the heart of the conspiracy, and we need to do it before they have the chance to strike again. You got anyone in mind for that job? Voss asked, folding his arms across his chest. Zaravis's gaze sharpened, meeting his directly. I was thinking, you. Voss blinked, genuinely surprised. Me? Are you sure that's a good idea? I mean, you did hire me to be expendable. I made a mistake, Zaravis said, her tone carrying no trace of hesitation. You've proven yourself useful. More than useful, actually. Voss grinned. Useful. I think that's the nicest thing you've ever said to me, Your Majesty. Zaravis rolled her eyes, but there was a warmth in her gaze that hadn't been there before. It was dangerous, letting herself feel anything beyond calculation. But with Voss, things had shifted in ways she hadn't anticipated. She didn't like it. Not exactly, but she couldn't deny it either. You do realize, Zaravis said, that this isn't going to get easier. If we want to stay ahead of the conspirators, we'll need to be one step ahead at all times. We'll be fighting on every front. Political, military, personal. Good, Voss replied with a lopsided grin. I get bored when things are too easy. Zaravis shook her head in exasperation, though a small smile tugged at her lips. You're impossible. And yet, Voss said, stepping closer, here we are. Side by side, the air between them shifted, charged with something unspoken but undeniable. Zaravis met his gaze, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself acknowledge the pull she felt toward him, a strange, reckless pull that made no sense but felt entirely right. Before either of them could speak, Zaravis's communicator buzzed. She tapped it, and the voice of one of her most trusted aides crackled through the channel. Your Majesty, we have intel. The conspirators are gathering for a final meeting tonight. If we act quickly, we can intercept them. Zaravis's eyes narrowed. Send the location. Voss raised an eyebrow. Final meeting, huh? Guess they're tying up loose ends. Yes, Zaravis replied, already shifting into action. And we're going to make sure they don't leave with the upper hand. Voss grinned, adrenaline kicking in. I like the way you think, Your Majesty. They moved swiftly, making their way through the city toward the meeting point. It was a hidden estate on the outskirts of the capital, heavily guarded and crawling with conspirators. The odds were against them, but neither Zaravis nor Voss had ever been ones to back down from a challenge. As they approached the estate, Voss shot Zaravis a grin. All right, so what's the plan this time? Or are we going with my usual favorite, improvisation? Zaravis gave him a pointed look. We do this quietly, no improvising. Quietly, Voss said, feigning disappointment. Where's the fun in that? Zaravis rolled her eyes but couldn't stop the small smile that crept across her face. Just follow my lead, human. They slipped into the estate like shadows, navigating through corridors lined with guards and security systems. Voss kept close to Zaravis, his senses sharp and ready for anything. Despite their differences, they moved as a team, silent, efficient, and dangerous. When they reached the central chamber, they found the conspirators gathered around a holographic display, deep in discussion. Zaravis's heart raced, but her expression remained calm, her every move precise. "Time to end this," she whispered. In a blur of motion, they struck. Zaravis moved with lethal grace, incapacitating guards and disarming conspirators before they could react. Voss followed suit, his movements fast and fluid, his grin never leaving his face. Within minutes, the conspirators lay subdued on the ground, bound and at Zaravis's mercy. "You've lost," Zaravis said coldly, standing over the ringleader. The alien sneered. "You think this ends here, Queen? There will always be more waiting to take your place." Zaravis's gaze hardened. "Perhaps, but not today." With a final decisive move, she dismantled the conspiracy, ensuring that her enemies would never threaten her throne again. The battle was over, and the future, uncertain as it was, belonged to her. Voss leaned against the wall, catching his breath. "Not bad, Your Majesty. Not bad at all." Zaravis gave him a rare, genuine smile. "You weren't so bad yourself, human." Voss chuckled. "So, does this mean I get a raise?" Zaravis shook her head in exasperation, but there was warmth in her eyes. "You're incorrigible. That's why you like me," Voss replied with a wink. Zaravis didn't deny it. Instead, she stepped closer, her gaze steady and unguarded for the first time. "Stay by my side, Voss," she said softly. "Not as a mercenary, as something more." Voss's grin softened, his usual bravado giving way to something genuine. "Well, Your Majesty," he said, "how could I possibly say no to that?" And as they stood together under the starlit sky, the weight of their journey behind them and the future wide open before them, Zaravis knew that her gambit had succeeded, not in the way she had expected, but in a way that felt right. Together, they would face whatever came next, and for the first time in a long while, Zaravis felt ready for whatever the future held.